The big lie wasn't just about this last election. You've been lied to for centuries. In the early 1600s, when James VI was King of England, he believed he was ordained by God to be king of the whole world, including these lands that were occupied by over 70 million native people, far exceeding the entire population of Europe. Those English lords first brought indentured servants to build shelters and tend livestock, grow crops, and fight the natives and the colonizers from other European countries. They were outnumbered and terrified, but they were gripped by ambition and a fantasy of divine rights. For 50 years, the lords of the new colonies forced over 1 million Africans into work camps. Predictably, these English tribes faced constant rebellions, native rebellions, slave rebellions, peasant rebellions. The English tribes lived in a continuous state of terror, and they believed that there were devils all around them, threatening their God-given rights to rule the New World, and they responded violently. The Salem witch trials in 1692, they exemplify that paranoia. 30 women found guilty of witchcraft, 19 executed by hanging. And what they thought was witchcraft was anything that appeared foreign. Anything new or different was from the devil. These English tribal lords, warlords, they were fanatical about the control that they imposed on those that they ruled. Every tribal colony had their own set of laws describing how the lords determined rent and taxes for the peasants living on the land that they were occupying by force. And as time went on, these English lords, they began describing these laws as their rights. These aren't liberties they're establishing for the peasant class. These are authorities that they're taking from the monarchy and giving to themselves. Virginia's Declaration of Rights includes the authority to command the peasant class serve in Virginia's military. And that law reads as follows, Section 13, that a well-regulated militia composed of the body of the people should be under strict subordination to and governed by the civil power. Take note of that phrase, body of the people. The body of the people means the citizens that actually occupy the colonies. The church used a similar expression. The body of the church just means the parishioners, the flesh. When we say the church, we're talking about leadership, the official word of Jesus Christ on earth. When these British subjects decided to create a country for the people, they weren't talking about the body of the people, but personal ambition. And they used every argument at their disposal to whip support for their new hierarchy, which continued to include forced labor, indentured servitude, wage slavery, and a strict caste system. Now, around that time, there's a savage officer of Virginia's militia, a wealthy landowner who, like many of the warlords of the colonies, is getting pretty resentful of the monarchy and their oppressive taxes. And this man complains that custom and use shall make us as tame and abject slaves as the blacks that we rule over with such arbitrary sway. That officer's name was George Washington. John Adams, a Boston lawyer, agreed, and he says, referring to the monarchy, that we won't be their Negroes. Not all the English lords thought or talked like that. There was Benjamin Lay. He was an elder in Pennsylvania and a friend of Ben Franklin. He once kidnapped the child of slaveholders to show them how Africans felt. Ben Lay and all the Quakers abolished slavery by the 1760s, expressing in no uncertain terms that holding people captive in work camps was in no way Christian. And there were many other people that agreed, but not the lords of the 13 English tribes, not enough to do anything about it. Their focus was increasing their power and independence from the monarchy, which would require uniting for that reason and none other, which they memorialize in a document called the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union. This is the first time they call themselves the United States of America, and their agreement includes a mandate that each colony keep ready their peasant militias because they know that war is coming. And war is expensive, so the lords borrow money from France and Spain and the Netherlands to supply rations, ammunition, and arms, and they form a professional continental army who, with the help from the state militias, fight with the full military support of Spain and France for 8 years, which leads to England finally giving up on their colonies in 1783. The former English lords were free from their monarch, but deeply in debt, so they tax the body of the people, just like the king had done to them. And within a few years, the peasants, the farmers, the Revolutionary War veterans, and their families are so overtaxed, they're behind on payments, and there's a national debt crisis. Some Revolutionary War veterans were never paid a cent for their service, are behind on their taxes to pay for that war, and so the lords seize their property. That's the last straw for a New England veteran named Daniel Shays, who gathers 4,000 men to overthrow the tyrannical government of Massachusetts. Well, George Washington and the Founding Fathers are panic-stricken. They get these wealthy merchants in Boston to fund a private mercenary army to back up the Massachusetts state militia and they crush this anti-tax rebellion. 18 of the rebels are hanged. Daniel Shays is pardoned, but the Boston press calls him an anarchist. And George Washington writes to James Madison, "We are fast verging on anarchy and confusion." And Washington writes letters to other lords. He says, "Commotion of this sort, like snowballs, gathers strength as they roll, if there's no opposition in the way to divide and crumble them. I am mortified." Virginia Attorney General Edmund Randolph is also mortified. His slaves had revolted and joined the British Army, and his father had fled, returning to England, wanting nothing to do with an independent America. Randolph, like so many of the other lords, was terrified about the prospect of anarchy from the laxity of government everywhere. And so James Madison and Benjamin Franklin and George Washington and the other lords of the colonies, they meet to address the failures of the Articles of Confederation, to maintain law and order, and enforce the collection of taxes. And they agree that they need to centralize power and write a constitution. And the most pressing concern is how to calculate that tax collection and how the states are going to be represented. Well, many of the lords agree with John Adams that very few men who have no property have any judgment of their own. But Ben Franklin reminds them that common people also fought for independence. James Madison, he's diligent in making sure this new governing document protects the minority of the opulent from the tyranny of the masses, meaning protect the rich from the poor. And this premise is close to his heart because his grandfather had been poisoned to death by an insurrectionist slave, which awkwardly brings up the question of slavery itself. 10 states had already outlawed human trafficking, but Georgia and 2 of the Carolinas, they threatened to leave if there was a ban. Not only that, but they wanted their forced laborers to be counted for purposes of their state's representation. Well, the northern states, they liked that idea if it meant higher taxes from the Carolinas. And that's where that horrific compromise comes from, counting the victims of human trafficking as 3/5 of a person for the purposes of taxation and representation. Well, there were more than a few people who thought this so-called compromise was psychopathic. Let's take Gouverneur Morris, a delegate from Pennsylvania. He delivered a speech on the topic at the convention. He said, "You mean to tell me the inhabitant of Georgia and South Carolina, who goes to the coast of Africa and in defiance of the most sacred laws of humanity, tears away his fellow creatures from their dearest connections and damns them to the most cruel bondages, shall have more votes in a government instituted for protection of the rights of mankind than the citizen of Pennsylvania or New Jersey, who views with laudable horror so nefarious a practice?" Well, that's exactly what happened. Gouverneur Morris got it right. In the end, for law and order and the collection of their taxes, the former English lords allowed slavery to continue, allowed a fraction of white men to have voting rights, and gave the slave states unequal representation to placate any further objections and get this tax collection underway. The lords of the 13 colonies were willing to make whatever compromise, whatever deal with the devil required to have the largest tax base possible to pay off their debts and to continue building an empire on par with those European colonial powers that they aspired to be themselves. Ratification of this Constitution was not unanimous. It was by the skin of its teeth. New York approved the U.S. Constitution by 3 votes, but it passed. Authority over the Union was established in the new capital of Washington, D.C., named after the first president and the richest man in the entire North American continent. And now the lords turned their focus back to the war debts. They owed $54 million as a confederation and $25 million as individual colonies. And they never stopped arguing about the balance of power between themselves and a central government, so they wrote a Bill of Rights. And these rights were about them, the lords. They were not about the rights for the peasant class, let alone their own wives, women in general, slaves, or natives. So you have a choice. You can keep yourself shackled to the ghosts of those English tribal lords who claimed God himself commands you defend their hierarchy with your life in their long war against reality. But you know that road is a dead end. You can also choose another path, and you can unite with a nation that wants to learn from its mistakes, that wants to grow and evolve for the good of all the tribes of humanity. And you can rejoin the land of the living.